Michael Guy Thompson. Amazing story you may have read in the start of this paper, how not many of us have been brought up in Cuba, whose dad knew Ernest Hemingway and who knew Sartre, and who Michael did his training with Laing. And I think he's one of, if not the best exponent of the continuation of Lang's work into the 20th and 21st century. So Michael's going to be talking about Sartre and psychoanalysis, the role of freedom in the clinical encounter. Over to you, please, Michael.
Okay, thank you so much, Dale, and I'm very delighted to meet with all of you this morning. What, six o'clock, or what's that, 1800 hours where you guys are?
Yep.
Yeah. All right, so I'll, as Dale explained, the topic I want to talk about today is Sartre and psychoanalysis and the role of freedom in the clinical encounter. Now, this is a broad topic. Sartre had quite a lot to say about psychoanalysis. But given our limited time, I'm going to try to talk for maybe 40 minutes and leave plenty of time for some discussion. So as Dale was just suggesting, my relationship with Sartre and psychoanalysis is complex and very personal. I discovered Sartre in my teens, which turned out to be the perfect age to make his acquaintance. As Del mentioned, I grew up in Cuba in the 1950s, where my father, an American entrepreneur and chemical engineer, became friends with Ernest Hemingway, among the very few American expatriates who actually lived on the island. There are many Americans that lived in Cuba, but most of them sort of came and went. I was really fond of Hemingway. I got to spend a few times with him when he and my father would meet for drinks at the Floridita. And I remember one time, this was very late, maybe in the last year that all of us were living on the island, that Hemingway brought up the name of Jean-Paul Sartre, who I had never heard of. And he was very excited because Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir will be visiting. As any of you that are familiar with Sartre's background, you know, he was Marxist for many, many years. And, was very excited and curious about the Cuban Revolution. Now, Hemingway had a fairly low opinion about Sartre. He thought he was the epitome of French intellectual that Hemingway got to know intimately, living in Paris in the 1920s. But he admired Sartre, and as well admired his celebrity. Most of all, I think Hemingway admired Sartre's extraordinary fame and success. Though Sartre was not awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature until after Hemingway's death, which I think was in 1961, Hemingway had won the Nobel Prize in 1954. So he and Sartre were both bonded as writers, and especially by Hemingway's impact on French writing, which also impacted Sartre's own writing. They were both nonconformist, and they each insisted that the only way to live is authentically, which was a term I was only beginning to get familiar with. One of the things I admired most about Hemingway was that he did know how to live. He loved the life he was living, and he treated it like an adventure. You know, he lived in many, many places in the world, always where things were really just beginning to happen. Hemingway and Sartre were, as my Irish grandmother once suggested to me, a pair to draw to, two very extreme nonconformists. Now, I was too young to read Sartre at that age. I think I was just about 13, about to turn 14. But a few years later, after my family had to leave Cuba and return to their native Tennessee, I began to check Sartre out. So reading him, Sartre introduced me to existential philosophy. And it became a kind of religion to me, a secular one. This was also around the time I discovered Sigmund Freud. And I formed this surprising notion that Sartre and Freud were more or less saying the same thing, but in different languages. In the years that followed, I managed to get through Sartre's early philosophical works, but it was a section devoted to existential psychoanalysis in his magnum opus, Being and Nothingness, that really riveted my attention. By the time I graduated from high school, I decided I was going to become an existential psychoanalyst, whatever in the world that was. Well, life has a funny way of throwing us a curve now and then. Without warning, Tennessee drafted me into the Army and sent me to Vietnam in the summer of 1966. Like many of my compatriots there, I was convinced we were all sent there to die. I was lucky, however, to be assigned to an intelligence unit in Saigon. And this gave me the luxury to do some reading in my off time. I dove into Sartre and Nietzsche. They taught me that we're always dying, and that the closer you get to death, the more precious life becomes. I think Sartre in particular helped me live through that death and survive it. And for that, I'm always going to be grateful to him. So after leaving Vietnam and leaving the Army, I moved to San Francisco in order to study psychology. That was when I discovered R.D. Laing, the Scottish psychiatrist and existential psychoanalyst. By 1970, Laing was the most famous psychiatrist in the world, and by far the largest selling psychiatrist in the world, due to his best-selling books and his groundbreaking work with schizophrenia. I was soon on my way to London, abandoning my graduate studies in order to work with him. Like me, Laing was passionate about Sartre. One may even read Laing's classic, The Divided Self, as an integration of Sartre's philosophy and object relations theory. This was unusual. Nearly all the psychiatrists who were drawn to existential philosophy after World War II embraced Heidegger, not Sartre. Perhaps this was because so many of them were German-speaking psychiatrists, or because they were captivated by Heidegger's impenetrable prose, or they may have been put off by Sartre, the bad boy of existential philosophy. Or perhaps worst of all, they dismissed Sartre as just a Frenchman. I think what bonded me to Laing was that we had both discovered Sartre in our youth, in the throes of a rebellious period, and were each drawn to his contempt for everything bourgeois and conventional. This attitude is not typical of people who choose to enter the so-called mental health professions. As a class, I would characterize my colleagues here in California as unremittingly conventional, uncommonly anxious, materialistic social climbers. I know this sounds harsh, even petty, yet some of my best friends are psychoanalysts. But this is the kind of observation that Sartre inspired, perhaps the reason why few of my colleagues gravitated to him. What I want to talk about today, however, is Sartre's relationship with Freud, and in a broader sense with psychoanalysis, epitomized by his critique of Freud in Being and Nothingness. Freud, too, was a bad boy, a troublemaker, and obsessed with sex. This was probably what drew me to him as a teenager. Sartre and Freud, another pair to draw to. So here I am in the company of the three bad boys of the 20th century avant-garde, Sartre, Laing, and Freud. I was in heaven. So what is the relation between Sartre and psychoanalysis? Perhaps some of you are familiar with what he says about this in Being in Time, but I don't want to summarize all the complexities that he goes into there. Instead, I just want to focus on how Sartre's thinking transforms psychoanalysis into a truly human, which is to say, inherently personal way of engaging in clinical practice. In order to do this, I'm going to explore three topics that are basic to understanding the therapeutic process. The first concerns Freud's conception of the unconscious. The second is the concept of freedom and the role it plays in psychoanalysis. And third, what is the nature of change? How does that come about? And what exactly do we even mean by change? Let's begin with Freud's concept of the unconscious and the problems this concept continues to engender. Freud's first topography for demarcating a distinction between conscious and unconscious aspects of the mind concerned the nature of fantasy and the role it plays in neurosis. After he experimented with hypnotism, Freud surmised that each person is preoccupied with two kinds of fantasies. One I'm aware of, and the other I'm not aware of. Freud opted to label those that I'm not aware of unconscious, because we have no reflective experience of them. These so-called unconscious fantasies have been repressed, but because they still reside in the unconscious, they engender psychic conflict, which results in our dream life as well as our psychopathology. So that's the basic rudiments of Freud's conception of neurosis. Freud's first topographical model of the unconscious was simple. One portion of the mind is conscious, and the thoughts it contains are in the forefront of our awareness or reflective experience, whereas another portion of the mind is unconscious and composed of fantasies that are inaccessible to conscious awareness. Freud included a third element in this topography, the preconscious, which contains unconscious thoughts and memories that can be recollected at will. Freud's topographical model served as a map of what he termed psychic reality. So Freud's notion of psychic reality was then contrasted with factual reality, which is investigated by the empirical sciences and readily available for anyone to study. Yet, in what sense can one treat fantasies as realities when, after all, they're not real? Freud recognized that fantasies can be experienced as real in a similar way that objective reality is experienced. In other words, fantasies, though not literal depictions of the past, for example, nevertheless convey some meaning. And these meanings are capable of telling us more about our patients than the so-called facts of their history. By interpreting fantasies and their consequent symptoms as meaningful, Freud was able to obtain truths about his patients that would have otherwise remained hidden. His opposition between psychic and external realities served to juxtapose an inherently personal reality with a more concrete reality. Now, this isn't to say that concrete or objective reality is false, but it was Freud's genius to see that the truth of one's history can be derived from the communication of otherwise innocuous reflections by interpreting a patient's fantasies, everything a patient tells you in a session, as disguised messages. The recognition that fantasies could be conceived as messages suggested there was something concealed in them that the patient neither recognized nor understood. And of course, this doesn't just go on in a session of therapy, it's going on continually throughout our daily lives. So this means that fantasies actually serve a purpose for us. They disclose the intentional structure of our deepest longings and aspirations. They tell us what we desire. But Freud lacked a conception of intentionality that could explain how his patients were able to convey truths that they didn't know in a disguised and indirect manner. In other words, his patients unconsciously intended their symptoms and the attendant fantasies that explain them. They weren't caused by their unconscious or some external trauma. Yet Freud seemed conflicted as to the origin of these symptoms. He never entirely abandoned the idea that they must be caused by some traumatic something or other. If not external reality, then perhaps the vicissitudes of our unconscious fantasy life. And as we know, the notion of trauma as being the cause of all manner of psychopathology is one of the most popular current theories in psychology. Despite the recent development of relational analysis, which claims to approach the treatment situation from a more interpersonal perspective, contemporary analysts, with few exceptions, find it agreeable to use terms in which the impersonal aspect of the unconscious dominates. Analysts remain wedded to the notion that non-personal aspects of the mind account for the unconscious motives that guide us in our daily affairs, which in turn produce our psychopathology. So whereas Freud depicted psychoanalysis as essentially a science of the unconscious, and it is impossible to deny that it is also a science, if we can call it that, which is preoccupied with consciousness, if only implicitly. Terms like truth, epistemology, knowledge, understanding, comprehension pervade every psychoanalytic paper devoted to the unconscious. This is also the subject matter that Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, and Ricoeur devoted a considerable amount of their philosophical writings to. What is the nature of knowledge, and what role does it serve in our everyday lives? Of all the phenomenologists, it was Sartre who took psychoanalysis the most seriously, devoting a considerable amount of time coming to grips with Freud's notion about the unconscious. In Sartre's critique of psychoanalysis, he rejected Freud's topographical model for similar reasons that Freud eventually replaced it. In the topographical model, the only thing separating the system conscious from the system unconscious is a so-called censor, which according to Freud regulates what is permitted into consciousness and contrariwise what is repressed into the unconscious. This means that the censor is aware of everything, that which is conscious and unconscious alike. Yet, because the ego is unaware of the censor, this model posits a second consciousness, the censor, that is both unknown and unknowable to the ego. Sartre's problem with this model is obvious. The so-called censor is the de facto person who is being analyzed and disclaims knowledge of all the shenanigans that he's employing in order to disguise what he's up to, in addition to what Sartre terms bad faith. Freud also had problems with the implications of a second thinking subject. and decided to discard this model for one that contained only one subject that knows anything, the conscious portion of the ego, and not one but three subjects that do not know anything: the id, the superego, and the unconscious portion of the ego that employs defenses. Freud's subsequent revision of his earlier model, however, fares little better in Sartre's opinion. The topographical model is replaced with one that is less concerned with demarcating conscious and unconscious portions of the psyche than with determining the complex nature of psychic agency or subjectivity. Sartre's complaint with the new model is that it still fails to resolve the problem of bad faith, the problem of a lie without a liar. If anything, the new model gets even further away from Sartre's efforts to personalize the unconscious by instituting three psychic agencies that protect the conscious ego from any responsibility for his actions. How would Sartre propose to remedy that situation and to account for those actions that Freud claimed the conscious patient is unconscious of devising, while holding the conscious patient responsible for performing them? Sartre accomplishes this by introducing two sets of critical distinctions into the prevailing psychoanalytic vocabulary. The first is a distinction between pre-reflective consciousness and reflective consciousness. So in Freud, you only have one, and the second is between consciousness and knowledge. Sartre summarizes the basic dilemma of Freud's conception of the unconscious with the following question: how can the subject not know that he is possessed of a feeling or sentiment that he is in possession of? And if the unconscious is just another word for consciousness, which is what Sartre is implying, how can the subject not know what he is conscious of? Sartre's thesis of pre-reflective consciousness is his effort to solve this riddle. Following Husserl, Sartre saw consciousness as intentional, which means it is always conscious of something. This means there is no such thing as empty consciousness, nor there is any such thing as a container or receptacle that houses consciousness. Instead, it's always outside itself and in the things that constitute it as consciousness of something. In Sartre's words, intentionality is not the way in which a subject tries to make contact with an object that exists beside it. Intentionality is what makes up the very subjectivity of subjects. In other words, the concept of intentionality renders subjectivity as already a theory of intersubjectivity, since to be a subject is to be engaged with something other than oneself, even if this other something is merely an idea. Sartre elaborates how this thesis would be applied to the social world in a very famous passage. When I run after a streetcar, when I look at the time, when I'm absorbed in contemplating a portrait, there is no I or ego. There is only consciousness of the streetcar having to be overtaken, etc. In fact, I am then plunged into the world of objects. It is they which constitute the unity of my consciousness. It is they which present themselves with values, with attractive and repellent qualities. Me? I have disappeared. I have annihilated myself in the moment of conscious apprehension. So what does this mean? Sartre's trying to say that when I experience a rock, a tree, a feeling of sadness, or the object of my desire, in the bedroom, I experience them just where they are, behind a hill, on the meadow, in my heart, in relation to myself and my beloved. Consciousness and the object of consciousness are given at one stroke. These things constitute my consciousness of them, just as I constitute their existence as things through the act by which I perceive them and give them a name. And because naming things is a purely human activity, these things do not exist as rocks, trees, or emotions, in the absence of a consciousness that can apprehend them through the constitutive power of language. Yet such acts of apprehension don't necessarily imply knowledge of what I am conscious of. And this is where some of the terminology gets a little tricky. We normally associate consciousness with knowledge. Here, Sartre is dividing the two as not identical. Sartre distinguishes between pre-reflective apprehension of an object and reflective witnessing of the act. Ordinarily, when I'm pre-reflectively conscious of a feeling, for example, I intuit the feeling of sadness and in turn reflectively acknowledge this feeling as sadness. Sometimes it's not so clear what that feeling is. Am I feeling depressed? Am I in a state of mourning? Am I resisting feeling sadness by latching on to depression? It's not so simple to go through this inventory of different words for feelings that often we experience as identical. I feel sad and experience myself as a sad person simultaneously. But I'm also capable of feeling sadness or anger or envy without knowing that I am sad or angry or envious. And I'm sure you've had many experiences where you're speaking with someone who appears quite angry with you. And if you note this to them, they're quite shocked because they'll insist that they're not feeling angry. They have a different word for it. Maybe they're feeling passionate. So words do matter. I'm capable of feeling sadness or anger or envy without knowing that I am sad or angry and envy. When my analyst suggests or points something of this nature out to me, I'm surprised. Initially, I may resist my analyst interpretation and even reject it. No, that's just not true. I'm not feeling angry right now. But I may eventually admit it in time, because when bringing this to my attention, I'm also quite capable, after reflecting, of recognizing this feeling as mine. Sartre argues that I would be incapable of recognizing thoughts or ideas that I claim no awareness of unless I had been conscious of these feelings in the first place on a pre-reflective level. Though conscious, the pre-reflective isn't known, according to Sartre. It is simply lived. In other words, what Freud labels consciousness, Sartre designates reflective consciousness, knowing that I'm conscious of this or that. And what Freud labels the unconscious, Sartre designates as that moment of pre-reflective consciousness that, because of bad faith, has not yielded to reflective awareness, and with that awareness, knowledge of it. This is why I can be conscious of something and have no immediate knowledge of it, and why I can become knowledgeable about something that I am, so to speak, unconscious of. But I'm also subsequently able to recognize and acknowledge that this is happening with me. This implies that I can only experience something I have knowledge of, but not what I am pre-reflectively conscious of. And of course, many people talk about unconscious experiences, especially in some object relations theories. I think Laing and existential in general would say that experience has to always be something that you are fully aware of. That's why you can have a feeling and not know that you have a feeling, because you're not experiencing the feeling. Once it becomes into awareness, you're experiencing it. The difference between Sartre's and Freud's respective formulations isn't that it merely substitutes Freud's terminology into Sartre's. On a more radical level, it eliminates a need for the very notion of a second thinking subject behind or beneath consciousness, and offers a way to personalize the unconscious in a manner that Freud was never quite able to accomplish. So now I want to take a moment and turn to talk about Sartre, some of Sartre's ideas about the emotions. In turning to emotions, Sartre was able to transform a psychoanalysis that was rooted in psychology to one rooted in phenomenology. First, I want to ask, what are emotions? There is no shortage of theories that try to tackle this problem, yet no consensus on a definition. For some, emotions are distinct from cognition and judgment, and for others, our feelings are central to decision-making and even determine our judgments. It's undeniable that emotions tell us things that our cognitions often miss. Moreover, emotions are often the driving force behind our motivations, whether positive or negative. And what about the relationship between emotion and desire? Are emotions derived from desires, or are they determinant of desires? Whatever they are, we cannot deny that we would not be human without them. The term emotion itself dates back to 1579, when it was adapted from the French émouvoir, meaning to stir up. It was first introduced to academic circles to replace a similar term, passion. Though the two terms have often been used interchangeably, passion is typically employed today when referring to sexual feelings. There is also the problem with the respective etymology. Passion derives from the Latin pati, meaning to suffer or endure. One can see why the term passion begins to take on different connotations than when simply feeling this or that. The French émouvoir appeared to solve the problem. Like the term feeling, with which emotion is used synonymously, an emotion is of brief duration, whereas moods last longer. The more recent affect, adopted by psychoanalysts, encompasses all three. So psychoanalysis went a long way in explaining how human behavior is not orchestrated by random events, because actions always have a motive, an intention, and a specific end, even if we don't know what that end is. Psychoanalysts were the first to emphasize the significance of psychic phenomena, that the seemingly innocent thought or emotion usually stands for something else. The child who steals from his mother's purse is only trying to reclaim the mother's love. A girl who faints at the sight of parsley can't bring herself to recall a painful childhood incident when she was forced to eat vegetables. Yet, often as not, the psychoanalytic interpretation, if only surreptitiously, tends to privilege causal antecedents, masquerading as interpretations in order to explain pathogenic behavior. Now, we know that history plays a crucial role in all our lives. And this is just as true for people suffering from emotional disturbances. This is why I can project onto all women, for example, the quality of withholding, because my mother was too depressed to comfort my needs. Each time I feel attracted to a woman, I find myself consumed with ambivalence, fear, consternation. The feelings I experience in these situations not only color my understanding of reality, to a significant degree, they determine who I am. Freud's term for the traumatic moment every child is supposed to experience, of course, was the Oedipus complex. What makes this complex so compelling is the sense of betrayal that occasions it, feelings that every boy or girl must eventually come to terms with. I can't say whether Sartre was influenced by Freud's dark assessment that love plays in our lives, yet the respective views on the matter are remarkably similar and form the basis of Sartre's many plays and novels. Now, emotions may be pleasing or they may be painful. The pleasurable kind we don't question unless they become self-destructive, and even then we rarely oppose them. The emotion introduces to pleasure. Painful emotions are more invasive because they elicit distress. We can bear them for only so long. Like Jason clutching the Medusa, we divert our eyes and blind our experience of them with magic, what Freud termed defense mechanisms. Our emotional life, always a mystery to us, inhabits a spectrum between desire and anxiety, each feeding the other. If we're creatures of desire and anxiety is the price we pay for them, then emotions must be entangled inside these desires in principle. Emotions are not merely barometers that tell me when my desires are satisfied or thwarted. They also possess an intelligence that aims to make my life as agreeable as possible. That's not all. My emotions shelter me from realities that are too painful to bear. Sartre suggested that emotions are our way of magically transforming a situation we get stuck in, like a fly on a sticky mat, that we can neither accommodate or escape. In other words, emotions provide a way of escaping situations that would otherwise drive me crazy. According to Sartre, quote, when the paths before us become too difficult, or when we cannot see our way, we no longer put up with such an exacting and difficult world. All ways are barred, and nevertheless, we must act. So then we try to change the world, that is, to live it as though the relation between things and their potentialities were not governed by deterministic processes, but by magic. So he goes on to suggest that the woman who faints at the sight of her attacker does so not because it reminds her of some previous event, but because it removes her magically from the present situation. She no longer has to face the immediate danger that she is in. But this isn't to say she willfully faints with deliberation. She is seized by the situation, a situation that makes demands on her and which she is unable to cope. Or rather, her manner of coping is so ingenious that it is unrecognizable as such to the unwary observer. The unlikelihood of finding a solution to the problem she faces demands that she invent a solution instead. If she can't take flight in reality, she can do so emotionally, which is to say magically. Yet an emotional response isn't just a substitute for other kinds of action, other ways of coping, because it isn't effectual. It doesn't act on the world, but merely changes my perception of it. This is why emotion is closely related to madness, the loss of reality. On a more basic level, the emotion is a structure of desire. It may be a way of enhancing a desire I enjoy, or a way of coping with a desire that becomes risky. The person in danger wants to be somewhere else, so the fainting magically fulfills the wish to disappear. Similarly, if I want something I cannot have, my emotions can help remove the desire itself, allowing me to escape a bitter disappointment. Sartre invokes the sour grapes analogy, which I imagine you've all heard, as a common rationalization for this strategy. Again, quoting Sartre, I lift my hand to pluck a bunch of grapes. I cannot do so. They're beyond my reach. So I shrug my shoulders, muttering, they're too green, and go on my way. This little comedy that I play under the grapes, thereby conferring the quality of being too green, serves as a substitute for the action I cannot complete. I confer the required quality upon the grapes magically, from being desirable to being undesirable. Of course, we do that all the time, don't we? Sartre's purpose in this early phenomenological study, titled Sketch for a Theory of the Emotions, was to show why behaviorism is incapable of explaining the phenomenon of emotions, because behaviorism is stuck in a cause and effect universe that cannot account for the intentional structure of our motives, our folly, our emotions. Psychoanalysis goes further because it is sensitive to human agency, but then ascribes our motivations to unconscious responses to trauma that, if we aren't careful, may be just as causal as behaviorism. At its best, what is often lacking in the psychoanalytic explanation is the personal dimension to motives, because unconscious motives are not, strictly speaking, personal in the view of Freud. So we're not supposed to be able to take responsibility for them. So what are therapy patients supposed to make of this? How are they supposed to effect change in their lives? Isn't this the purpose of psychoanalysis? To change our manner of being in the world and improve it? How can this happen without turning the therapeutic situation into a technology, a disembodied set of techniques designed to manipulate and even mystify the patient this way or that? The essential task of existential psychoanalysis, as envisioned by Sartre, is hermeneutic. That is, deciphering the meaning of acts in relation to a synthetic totality, underpinned by an original project of being, manifested in a fundamental choice. But what is choice exactly, especially in the context of unconscious behavior? We ordinarily speak of choice as a volitional, deliberate act that is transparent to itself. This suggests that we're always ahead of our choices, that we weigh them in our minds, and having decided upon this or that option, execute them. Sartre even is sometimes accused of adopting this model, but it really isn't that simple. Say I want to go to the cinema. Which movie do I choose to see? I look at the options and pick this one over that. There, I've deliberated, weighed my options, and chosen the one most desirable. Or have I? One of the things that both Freud and Sartre share in common is that neither buys this explanation. Though separated by an enormous gulf in theory, temperament, and vocation, each concluded, as did Heidegger, that choices are free, but not willful. Instead, they are predetermined. Something or other predisposes me into making that choice. Freud would say, I did so unconsciously. Sartre would argue that choice occurred on a pre-reflective level. In both cases, it wasn't my ego or I that chose the action. the choice executed was rendered before the fact, beneath awareness, in my engagement with the world. The so-called conscious choice merely makes it official after the fact. In other words, I cannot get ahead of my choices. I'm always one step behind them as they guide me this way or that. So the choice itself and the reasons I make them are puzzling. This is why psychoanalysis, as envisioned by Freud, is always retrospective, not prophylactic. Only in behavioral psychology do we play the fiction of deliberating what we intend to do and then execute the act. In psychoanalysis, the idea is to review previous actions and to learn something about ourselves from them. The actions reviewed may be buried in our childhoods, or they may have occurred moments earlier in the therapy session. In either case, we're not talking about an executive function, but a reflective one. Now, this has led some commentators to conclude that Freud's conception of the unconscious was deterministic. If we don't make our choices consciously, which is to say voluntaristically, then our choices must be made for us by our unconscious. This implies there is no free choice in the matter if the choice isn't willfully executed. Psychoanalysts make this assumption because the unconscious is supposed to be impersonal, not personal. In Freud's tripartite structure, it isn't me guiding my decisions, but my id, which we know is Latin for it. This is the crux of Sartre's problem with the psychoanalytic conception of the unconscious. Again, the problem of a lie without a liar, a thought without a thinker, an action without an actor. What is at stake here is our very notion of the self, what comprises the self, and how free the self is. For Sartre, there is no self, so to speak, no I, not even a subject. If by subject we mean some sort of entity, like the censor or a god that orchestrates our lives through executive decision-making. Unlike Freud, Sartre roots the person not in psychology, but in situation, in the world to which we belong, the world where we live and die. All of my choices derive from my engagement with that world, not in my psychology. That doesn't mean that I'm determined by that engagement. I am that engagement. I have choices in the matter, and those choices are always free. But that doesn't mean I am in control of the situation. The fact that my choices are free doesn't mean I'm Superman. Freedom doesn't make me omnipotent. It isn't a freedom to rule, but a freedom to be me, and ultimately to embrace the me that I am. This means that my choices are ontological rather than deliberative. Sartre suggests our neuroses go all the way back to a fundamental choice in childhood when we chose what our neurosis would be on a pre-reflective level. In other words, we intend our psychopathology. We are not the consequence of this or that trauma. Contrary to psychoanalysis, nothing caused my condition. Rather, I chose to experience this or that incident as traumatic. Like the magical choice, there's always something to be gained by every neurotic turn, though we don't realize it at the time. After all, we didn't choose to be this. If we didn't choose to be this way or that, how could change be possible? Given this thesis, how is therapy even possible? If I cannot will myself to health, then how does it come about? As Kierkegaard would have said, through indirection. In this context, all my conscious knowing mind is good for is to acquaint myself with the mystery of my existence and to plummet its depths over an unpredictable amount of time. I cannot will myself to overcome my fear of intimacy. I cannot compel myself to love more fully, behave more compassionately, or feel more alive. Yet all of these transitions may and often do result from the analytic endeavor. How? We don't know exactly. All we do know is that knowing oneself has the potential to change our lives in this way, to become who we are authentically. If we're intrepid over time, this process of self-reflection may result in a change of perspective, and with it, a change in ourselves, which is to say, our lives. This can only happen indirectly, over time, without ever knowing that we have made these changes until after having made them, and without ever knowing why. This is where authenticity comes into the picture. When I tell myself I hate the person that I am, that I cannot give up my addictions, that I wish I could be more this or less that, in effect, I'm really lying to myself. Because every choice I make is a free choice. And because everything that I am is a consequence of the choices that I have made in the past, I'm always the person I wish to be. To be in conflict with myself is to pretend that something or other has caused me to be this one, something other than my free choice to be me. Even this form of ambivalence is a choice. Nothing I think or do is inflicted on me. To pretend otherwise is our favored method of denial. Sartre would say it's bad faith in its essence. This also means that the goal of existential psychoanalysis is to become the person I already am, not ambivalently, but unreservedly, wholeheartedly, passionately. This is not an ethical endeavor to make me a better person. I don't know if Sartre would agree with this, but it seems to me this form of radical self-acceptance that it aspires to is an act of love. It entails falling in love with the person that I am and always have been, the same person who lived this life, who suffered its folly, and up to this very moment. I hope Sartre would forgive me for this, but at the end of the day, it seems to me existential psychoanalysis is precisely what Freud said it was, a cure through love. Now, in conclusion, how has this perspective affected my way of working with psychoanalytic patients? I think, like perhaps all analytic practitioners, I assumed early in my career, going back some 40 years or so, that the therapeutic enterprise was all about change. The word has always haunted me. I remember thinking that I wanted to tackle this problem head on and to write a book about change, what it is, how it is affected, and so on. I abandoned this project once I realized that the very concept of change is problematic. We don't even know what it is. It was only later, when I had absorbed some insights from the existential philosophical tradition, that I finally came to realize that psychoanalysis isn't about change, but rather becoming. Change implies that something that was should be discarded and replaced with something else. This works fine in the physical world, where we readily change one flat tire for a new one, a house we no longer cherish for one more desirable, and so on. But you don't discard the person that you are for a new, improved model. You're stuck with who you are, for better or worse, for life. This is when it came to me that we are always becoming, but not strictly speaking, changing. In becoming, we are always what and who we are, but we are never finally that person until the end, until the day we die. Meantime, we are constantly, ceaselessly becoming more and more ourselves. But this becoming isn't a panacea. Without reflection, without care, without concerted effort to reflect on our situation, we very well may simply become more and more miserable. Instead, more and more alienated from ourselves in order to escape the anguish of living. Existential psychoanalysis provides an opportunity to become something different than that. It offers the opportunity, with no guarantees, to become more and more the magnificent creature that we already are. Once on the road to becoming and embracing ourselves, we have a chance to be at peace with ourselves. When we're finally at peace with ourselves, we're at peace with the world. Thank you.
Michael, thanks very much indeed. Thank you. I see you drinking alcohol after the water. There. Here's some questions, some comments, some thoughts, either from the people here or the people also on the screen. Over to us.
The thing about becoming at the end sounds quite Rogerian, almost.
Kierkegaard.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, all that.
Or Nietzsche. There we are. Okay.
Yeah, there's a thread of that through all of them, isn't there? For sure. All existentialist. Sounds very Buddhist too, doesn't it?
Thank you, Michael. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's refreshing to hear an American not speak of Sartre as a pessimist or as a nihilist, which seems to be the consensus when I hear from phenomenologists or existential therapists from the States. For some reason, Sartre gets this label of being a nihilist and a pessimist. So thank you for that very informative lecture. One thing, a couple of things briefly. What is at stake is the notion of the self, you said. The self is rooted in situation, not in psychology. This seems so absolutely crucial to the endeavor of therapy. And in particular, I'm thinking of Sartre's contribution, a small book, published in 1957, Search for a Method. In Search for a Method, he critiqued what he calls the fetish or the fetishism of interiority. As you said, it's not a psychology. The tendency to want to explain and study the self from within, forgetting the situational element. But that for him also meant a commitment to an emancipatory politics. It meant also a commitment to Marxism, which is a way of seeing the world which has become almost a taboo world, a taboo term. How, so the question for me that Sartre poses is very sharp. How can we get beyond this fetishism of interiority? And he does so when he discusses Flaubert and the fact that there is no simple understanding of Flaubert without situating him in the bourgeois family and bourgeois society from of which he was expressing that. So how to get out of the trap of interiority, which I believe is something shared across orientations.
Mm-hmm.
I would say including psychoanalysis, or including the way what psychoanalysis has become, this emphasis on psyche still understood as interiority. And also, briefly, is it a hermeneutics? Is it a hermeneutics? Because if we say it's a hermeneutics, then we attempt to translate and perhaps betray a much more complex content into something that can be quantified or cognitively explained. And finally, your very important point about emotion. I wonder what Sartre would have made of recent development, post-phenomenology. In particular, I'm thinking of affect theory. The origin of emotions is not found in subjectivity, but it's found in affect, in the neutral intensity of life that hits the individual and then gets broken down into emotions. Perhaps more than asking a question, I'm simply associating with some of the things you raised. So I hope this makes sense and that it's useful somehow. But I appreciate what you make of this.
Yeah, thank you, Manu. I really appreciated those comments. The problem, the basic problem, I think, will always be the nature of the self, and this idea of interiority, which all phenomenologists are trying to dig us out of. But I do think it goes back to this difficulty of getting outside of a scientific framework rooted in physics, which is where causation originates, cause and effect. Freud, in his case histories, which I've read all of them, fascinating to me because in every one, he's trying to work his way back further and further to what caused neurosis. And every time he got to some incident, let's say, in the family, that was the patient could remember as painful. Okay, that sounds pivotal. But then he'd see that something even before that was also quite important, and kept going back and back and back. And in none of them did he ever find the ultimate cause. He never found that original, what Sartre calls the fundamental choice. What was the incident that really did it? And of course, he talks about the Oedipus complex, that our hearts get broken, etc. But how early does our hearts get broken, if we want to go with that analogy? Is it as soon as you've been born? So I think that there is no answer to that question. I don't think we're born with our neuroses. I think we do acquire them, and they become increasingly more sophisticated as we develop. in the first months and then first years of our life, especially with language. But we're going through our childhoods coping basically the best that we possibly can with all of the anguish and frustrations that we experience and the increasing demands made upon us and the increasing loss of privilege as we get older. There's all these things going on that Freud was convinced every child, of course, develops neuroses to get through all this. And if we're lucky, by the time we get through adolescence and into adulthood, we've kind of worked through the most serious ones. That, of course, doesn't always happen, and we wouldn't have a profession of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis if that were the case. But I think the idea of trauma is probably still the single most serious impediment to being able to rethink, how did I get to where I am and who I am? Because trauma is always based on something that happened to us that made us this way. And I don't agree with that premise. And I think that that's what phenomenology and existentialism are so helpful in giving us another way of understanding these phenomena. I know that's a tough idea to wrap one's head around, that it wasn't a trauma that caused me to become, say, fearful or insecure, but that I kind of latch on to the trauma to protect me from something even more painful.
I love it.
And that way I can release it, at some point. I can let go of it when I can.
And there goes the whole trauma industry. It's an excellent point.
It's the flavor of the month, isn't it?
Indeed.
Anti-trauma theory. I don't think that would sell a lot of books, do you?
Sorry, can you expand on what you mean by what would be more painful if you didn't latch on to the trauma?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
What can you expand a bit on what would be more painful than latching onto the trauma?
Well, okay, let's think of an example. When I was about 3, I think it was around that age, my birthday's on New Year's Day. So I believe this was the Christmas right before my birthday. And, we were living in Cuba, and I have 3 older sisters. My parents put out a huge spreader on the Christmas tree, presents, went all out. And so the story goes, I have no recollection of any of this. So the family myth, the way it's been repeated to me, is that they all woke up that morning and went to the tree and all the presents were missing. And in Cuba, you typically have some servants, that's common in Latin culture. And there was 1 or 2 that lived in, and so they immediately asked them, what happened, and they said Michael took all the presents and gave them away to the neighbors early this morning. And at first they couldn't believe that. They were dumbfounded. But they, went outside and they saw that there's been some wrappings on the street and so on. And so they immediately accepted that must be what I had done. And each of my family members, my mother and father and 3 sisters, took turns spanking me. for doing such a terrible thing. And now, like I say, I have no memory of this event. Of course, that's the borderline of, do you remember anything, from that age? But this story was told to me every Christmas as a very funny story to share with laughs. And I couldn't help but thinking, well, I must have been traumatized by this event. All of my family spanked me. The only time in my life I had ever received a spanking. And they were obviously hating me when they did that. And every Christmas throughout my childhood, I succumbed to depression. And I didn't know why, but come December, it would begin and intensified during the Christmas holiday, and then finally began to subside after New Year's. And this continued with, and I never put it together that this had anything to do with that Christmas. It was only when I went to London in my mid-20s to work with Laing and to go into psychoanalysis, this came up. And of course, my analyst immediately saw the connection and invited me to really, begin to look at that and think about my whole history of depressive episodes in this context. And it changed everything for me. In a matter of months, my depression completely disappeared. I've never had another bout of that depression. So I think just being able to understand that there was some correlation there, for me, was what turned out to be so powerful and so therapeutic. But yeah, the fear underlying, of course, in some ways, what's the trauma? Revisits of depression, feeling unloved, feeling alone in the world, feeling isolated. No matter what the real conditions of my life happened to be at that time. But surely the most painful thing that happened was the feeling that my family hated me. And of course, there was also a period where I wasn't even sure that I was the one who gave the presents away, but it was established later on that indeed it was me. It wasn't the servants who stole them. All the presents, by the way, were eventually returned by the neighbors. Anyway, that's just one example. I basically think that what happens when something similar that happens, let's say a parent abuses you or rapes a child, what happens? You dissociate from that. That's how many people report it. It's almost like it's not happening. They completely shut down. And because they employ defenses to protect themselves from the pain, they don't actually experience being abused. And it becomes repressed. Sometimes it comes back, but they can't let go of it. That fear is always there that it's going to happen again. And I think the only thing that unlocks that is by having a similar experience again, not necessarily being assaulted, but being hurt emotionally, that one doesn't defend oneself against, that you really let that pain in and suffer it and endure it. And that to me is why we're in psychoanalysis, is to revisit all of these things that happen in our lives that we remember, some we don't, and they pop up, but we didn't really have an experience of it. We pushed the experience of it away. Our recollection is fairly weak. So it's really through reliving the pain that seems to help getting rid of the trauma.
Thank you.
I've noticed that a lot of the psychedelic theory, I don't know if this is happening in the UK, it's happening all over America now, where people are doing mushrooms, LSD, and microdosing in order to explore their traumas. It's being used for people with PTSD, bipolar disorder, drug addiction, alcoholism, and Michael Pollan has a documentary series, 4 sections. In case you haven't seen that, it's fascinating, and it shows some of the participants going through the experience of taking the psychedelic, which immediately takes them back to that painful place. And they go through it for the first time, and the results have been remarkable.
Do you think
Are they doing that in the UK? Psychedelic therapy?
Yes.
Do you think then it should be, rather than existential psychoanalysis, it should be psychedelic existential psychoanalysis?
Well, they should be in tandem. I don't think that just taking a psychedelic in and of itself is necessarily going to be enough. That they always recommend that you are in therapy with someone when you're having this psychedelic experiences, because it takes a lot of processing. And some people have remarkable effects very soon, but I think you have to figure it may take you some time of repeated episodes over months or years to get the full benefit from it, just like psychoanalysis. And if you don't have an analyst, then I think they have people that will help you process it. But this is now, of course, unfortunately, it's going to be the next big thing, isn't it? It will be the big cure for everything you can imagine. And I'm not so sure that's a good idea. But anyway, I'm glad that it's available.
I don't know if I'm getting a bit confused there, but if you're sort of advocating we try and move away from a model of physics with cause and effect, I mean, in your story there, you managed to sort of trace a lot of well, your issue back to an event when you were 3. You're sort of contrasting your case study, as it were, to all of Freud's, where he couldn't find sort of an original cause of someone's neurosis, for example, like depression. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it seems that in your case you sort of managed to pinpoint, I don't know, all your problems and then undo them and then have happy Christmases thereafter. I don't know.
Oh yeah, I don't have any of that depression anymore, but obviously there's more to it than that. That was just a fairly dramatic example of a much bigger issue. Really, a lot of my personality and ambitions in life and so on have come from my relationships with my parents, especially my mother, who committed suicide after we left Cuba when I was 14. That was really the big thing that I was looking at in my psychoanalysis. It had a huge impact on my relationships with women throughout my adolescence and 20s. So, that's another, let's say, slice of the pudding, that there are so many things that go on in our childhoods and our lives that are painful. And, we want to just try not to shut our minds to it. If to the degree that we can open that up and be aware of it is all to the good. But if you were to ask me, well, what's caused me to develop any of my neurotic symptoms, I really wouldn't be able to tell you that. I would just say that somewhere in all that stuff going on in my childhood, I was probably shutting down a lot of things, Apparently I used to beat my head against the wall as a very young child around this age of the Christmas incident. And I think that was a statement I was making about my the chronic fighting that my parents engaged in. So there's many, many things that go on in our childhood that may be factors. We may have had a very happy childhood with very happy parents and no real traumatic events, discernible events of any kind that one can remember that occurred. But let's not forget that our entire childhood is traumatic. Just growing up, just weaning, toilet training, you know, going to new schools, getting to know kids, making demands of studies, you know, all of that, I think, is, you're going to use the trauma, life is traumatic. I don't think you have to be beaten or abused to be a traumatized person. I think we all come out of our childhoods somewhat traumatized.
Is there an idea that maybe we get away from the experience by plowing a lot of what we're experiencing into concepts, it's a way of distance, and then maybe that's perhaps what you're implying about, you know, well, it's all held in trauma, but actually it's held in us. And if we can get back to the experience of what we're actually in, and come away from the concepts, come away from everything, a bit like fantasy might hold something. These concepts of depression, anxiety, they hold things for us rather than being with the experience.
Yeah, you know, the Greek skeptics, I don't know if you've ever gotten exposed to Sextus Empiricus or Pyrrho, but they had this idea that, you know, to be a skeptic is to be a seeker, a searcher, an inquirer for knowledge. And they felt that you should set out to explore knowledge every way possible. And so let's say if you're going to be a psychoanalyst, read everything. Don't just latch onto one theory and say this is the answer. Compare them all, look at them all, and ultimately make it your own. Well, how do you make it your own? They compared acquiring knowledge to steps of a ladder. You know, everything you learn, you go up another step until you finally get to the top, and you, by that time, have exhausted the search, and you've realized you still don't know what is ultimately the true theory, and that's when you throw the ladder away and you don't need it anymore, and you just get on with learning stuff from your experience. That's why so many authors are always thanking their patients for teaching them everything they know about psychoanalysis. Only after they threw the ladder away and started really listening to their patients for the first time did they begin to learn something. But, you know, every science has its technical terminology. Every philosophy does too. But you don't want to talk to your patients that way, for sure.
Can I just say something? I think that what you're talking about, it's really important, especially what we're talking about trauma and the notion of causation, and how we are I think very much stuck in this idea that you know, humans are knowing subjects, and they causally relate to the world, or they're causally involved with the world. So I think that's really important. But what I wanted to ask you about was something to do with pre-reflective awareness. And I was wondering, to what extent is the pre-reflective awareness and reflective awareness, to what extent does it fit quite well on Heidegger's ready to hand and present at hand?
Well, I'm thinking of just a concrete example. Heidegger, of course, has vastly different language he doesn't use the word conscious and unconscious. They never are invoked anywhere in his thinking. He feels that the word consciousness is useless. And we wouldn't have the unconscious if it wasn't for the conscious, which I think started around Descartes' time, when that became a technical term in philosophy. But yes, how can you know what you're doing without knowing what you're doing? Look at driving a car, and you have a passenger in the seat, and you're driving down the motorway, and you're having this conversation, and your mind isn't really on the road, it's really on the conversation, and yet you're driving perfectly well without having any accidents. So if your conscious, deliberate mind is on the passenger, who's driving the car? Of course, now and then you do glance at the road and do, but your attention is divided, and that driving the road is the pre-reflective part of the consciousness. And it's only when you look back and think about it that you bring the reflective back into it. I think we do that all the time. This was Heidegger's observation, that we do things all the time without thinking about it. Riding a bicycle, walking. I mean, just think about it, the movement of your body. You'd have to be pretty schizophrenic to be a person who has to think their way through every bodily action. And there are people who are that terrified, and scared of their feelings. They have to use their minds to do everything. But normally, we're not thinking about what we're doing. We're not thinking about what we're saying. It just comes out. That's all, pretty much what we're talking about, is that we have overvalued the idea of surveillance, that our minds are some kind of a camera that is tracking everything going on. And it's by looking through that camera that we can see. But actually, we don't need it. We're in a way, we're flying blind for the most part. We're feeling our way through the world and through conversation. As Heidegger would point out, we only begin to think about something when we run into trouble, when suddenly you stub your toe, on the walk or whatever. Oh my God, how did I do that? The rest of the time, you're just doing it. There's no thinking involved. That's very difficult for anyone trained in psychology to comprehend, I think.
Well, Michael, we're over time. So 3 things. One, can we thank Michael again very much indeed? 2, Michael, you've got a book coming out with this as one of your collection of papers. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I have a book coming out early in the year with Routledge called Essays in Existential Psychoanalysis. It's a collection of 20 of my papers over the last 25 years, most of them published, some like this not published yet, but they all have this theme in them. It's working from this angle of being an existentialist, doing psychoanalysis. So yeah, I hope you'll run out and buy one when it comes out.
At least one, Michael. Thank you very much.